So thank you again for joining us for today's session, What Comes After WCAG 2.0. Our speaker today is Andrew Kirkpatrick. Andrew has been involved with accessibility at Adobe since 2005. He is responsible for overall strategy and management regarding Adobe's accessibility work, including standards and programs. He is also the co-chair of the W3C WCAG Working Group. We're delighted to have Andrew with us for today's presentation. Thank you for doing this, and I'll turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm waiting to see. There we go. So I can see it in the captions, so the answer to that is yes. I'm happy to be here today to talk about what happens after WCAG 2.0. I can see the participant list, and it's great to be able to say that I don't recognize everyone. And I think that's a great testament to the success of some of the work that the IAAP has done. I recognize a few people, but there's lots of new people that are focusing on accessibility, and I think it's great to have everyone joining us. So, as Kevin said, I'm in charge of Adobe's overall accessibility efforts, strategy, standards, policy, and implementation. Adobe has a team of people, product managers and engineers who work with across our product groups to help make sure that we're paying attention to accessibility. So while I'm here to talk about WCAG today, there will be contact information. So if you have questions that are about Adobe's tools or products, we can help direct you to the right place through separate conversations. But also, a big part of what I do is being the co-chair of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. This working group at the W3C used to be called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. And we, in the last year, rechartered, and we changed it to just be the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, in part because the working groups for user agent accessibility guidelines and authoring tool accessibility guidelines were closed, and so we're focusing everything underneath one working group right now. And this is right now a very big part of my job because of what the work that's going on with WCAG 2.1. So the question that people have to think about as we go through, as we start this conversation is, why are we updating WCAG 2.0? And WCAG 2.0, it's worth reminding people, came out December 11th, 2008. So it's been out for around a decade. And in that time, there's been, mass proliferation of new technologies, particularly related to touchscreen devices, small handheld devices that really make our experiences interacting with the web and web content different today than they were at the time that WCAG was developed and came out. And in this time as well, there's also been changes in technology that have improved the level of support that end users can experience. And so it's been important for us to keep an eye on what is going on with the external perception of how WCAG 2.0 is satisfying user needs and addressing the technologies that are in use. And throughout the intervening years that we had with WCAG 2.0, the working group was responding to comments from the public, requests for clarification, doing work to develop some of the supplementary documents, like the techniques and the understanding documents, to help clarify for users. And from that, we gained a lot of experience about where people were having trouble with the existing standard and where there were gaps in the existing standard. So ultimately, we know that we can never make a perfect standard. but we can do work to make sure that we're closing gaps as we find them. It's worth pointing out that in WCAG 2.0, there's a line that says that note that even content that conforms at the highest level, AAA, will not be accessible to individuals with all types, degrees, or combinations of disability, particularly in the cognitive, language, and learning areas. So even when WCAG 2.0 came out, we knew that there were still gaps. There were still improvements that needed to be made so that if you addressed WCAG 2 to the single A, you were providing greater accessibility than if you weren't. And double A, there was additional accessibility. Triple A, there's still more accessibility. But even beyond that, there's always room for further improvement. So when we talk about WCAG 2, we are hopefully not thinking that WCAG conformance with WCAG 2 equates to 100% accessibility, because it definitely does not. And for that matter, it is worth pointing out that for WCAG 2.1, the same will be true. We will ensure that conforming to WCAG 2.1 results in greater accessibility than WCAG 2.0, assuming you're conforming at the same level. But it's not going to be a cure-all for a website that is trying to have the greatest possible reach. And there will always be need for authors and publishers to engage in user testing and to try and refine the experience for users, including disabled users, ever further. Similarly, toward the end of the call, we'll talk a little bit about what comes after WCAG 2.1. But if we're talking about a WCAG 3 or for a WCAG 5, for that matter, the same is going to be true. We're trying to minimize the gaps to the greatest extent possible, but we know it's reducing the gaps but not eliminating them. So what is wrong with WCAG 2.0? That's usually a question that people have thoughts on, because everyone who uses WCAG 2.0 have their own experiences with it. Some people think it's wonderful and great. Some people think that it is terrible, difficult to read, confusing, and doesn't do as much as it should, and everywhere in between. And so when we talk about WCAG 2.0, a lot of the questions that we got centered around a few specific areas. Why doesn't WCAG 2 address content on touchscreen and small devices? Why doesn't WCAG 2 address cognitive requirements? Why doesn't WCAG 2 address low vision requirements? And so on. There's also questions that we've received about WCAG 2 and its applicability to digital publications. And as the first line in this slide says, the answer to each of the following is it does, but not completely, in that WCAG 2 does have requirements that if you're viewing content on a small screen mobile device, the fact that the content meets WCAG 2, let's say to the AA level, certainly makes that content more accessible than if it wasn't. And there are certainly requirements that are part of WCAG 2 that address cognitive accessibility requirements, but there's definitely gaps. And similarly for low vision. And so that's part of what we really wanted to make sure that we were focusing on. Digging in a little bit, I've avoided using a word a little bit in my slides, which is the question that people always ask is, what about mobile? And the working group has talked about this, I assure you, at length. And there's definitely challenges when we talk about, when we try and define mobile. Are we talking about smartphones? Are we talking about tablets? Are we talking about big tablets? Are we talking about tablets that come with keyboards? You know, so a Surface Pro or a iPad Pro, where there's a greater likelihood that someone has a keyboard that is attached to that device and they're expecting to use it. And of course, even a smartphone, an Android or an iPhone, you can connect a keyboard to it, and many people do, and some people need to in order to interact with these devices. So which ones of these constitute mobile? And what we found is that mobile resists a specific definition, and the way that we're addressing this right now is by talking about the aspects that are available and in many cases have been popularized by small mobile device usage. And so these ones here that we're focusing on with WCAG 2.1 are largely around the size of the screen. So with what we think of as mobile devices, we're getting much smaller screen size. The addition of touch as an interface option and additional sensor inputs. There's a lot of additional sensors from accelerometers to GPS sensors to a variety of other ones. And as the types of devices that people use increases, we will see those increase as well. So we're trying to be specific in order to have a broad applicability for the work that we're doing. And it is and it's hard because we will then also receive questions from people that are along the lines of, if you're talking about mobile, why don't you just say mobile? And that is a valid comment, and it's a valid concern because we're trying to make our guidelines as simple and easy to read and understand as possible. But the challenge is that the many different people that are reading and interpreting WCAG need tight, accurate definitions to be able to fall back on as they're reading this back, because otherwise it becomes ever more difficult to implement. So, talking about WCAG 2.1, in the last year, at the W3C, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group decided that we needed to recharter. At the W3C, working groups function over some period of time based on their charter, and in their charter they define what work they can do. And for many years, the WCAG working group was not chartered to create normative documents. And so we were just chartered to work on and update our informative documents. And these informative documents were techniques. We developed techniques for different technologies, PDF. We developed techniques for Flash and Silverlight, as well as integrating information about other types of document formats into techniques that we had. And these are things that are easier to do because they aren't full standards. They're just informative guidance from the working group. Similarly, understanding documents, we could offer clarifications, but people would frequently say, why don't you just make this change to this success criteria? And that's something that we were not allowed to do. So in the charter, which was in January of 2017, we put in for normative work and set a schedule for the publication of WCAG 2.1 to be published in mid-2018. So in the process for that, from the charter, we quickly went to a first public working draft, and I'll talk a little bit about how we managed to do that in 1 month, and since then have published multiple additional working drafts just as updates on where the working group is at so that we can get additional comments, solicit feedback from people who are not on the group. And this is ultimately going to lead us to a candidate recommendation in January of this year, which is starting to sound like it's very close to me, because I know between Thanksgiving and Christmas breaks that all of a sudden January is upon us. But from candidate recommendation, we will be working on collecting implementations so that if we have a candidate recommendation for WCAG 2.1, part of getting it to the finalization step, which at the W3C is the recommendation stage, we have to be able to prove that it's actually achievable. So being able to show that there's websites out there that can meet WCAG 2.1 is absolutely critical to the process. So we'll be doing that work as well as updating, understanding, and the techniques that are available for WCAG 2.1 and making sure that we're providing sufficient documentation. Through all this process, people will often wonder, well, what happens to WCAG 2.0? And it is very important to be crystal clear, I find, that WCAG 2.0 is still there. It is not being obsoleted. It is unchanged. So if you work for an organization that says WCAG 2.0 is our standard, then WCAG 2.1 being published is not going to affect that, at least not immediately. It would require an additional decision-making process by an organization to decide that WCAG 2.1 is something that they want to adopt. And the same goes for governmental organizations and references as well, so that the new Section 508 in the U.S. government incorporates WCAG 2.0, and we don't expect that it's going to reference WCAG 2.1 immediately. That requires a rulemaking process or a change process, and I expect that the U.S. Access Board is going to be looking closely at WCAG 2.1. They, in fact, have someone who's on the group, and we'll be able to use that knowledge and the reviews that they gather and the experience that they hear from people who are working with WCAG 2.1 to decide when is the appropriate time. We know that Section 508 gets updated every 5 years per the regulation, or it's supposed to get updated every 5 years. And so WCAG 2.1 will be available and ready when the Access Board or any other organization needs it. So the exact timing of when any website needs to conform to WCAG 2.1 is going to be dependent on whatever organizations or policies that they need to conform to. All right. So I do want to talk briefly a little bit about the WCAG, the team that makes WCAG. So the group that is of people that are on the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. Right now, I want to say there's about 50 or 60 active people. There's actually 129 participants that are on the working group. Anyone that is working for a W3C member company can very easily join the working group. in that they just have to tell their advisory committee representative to make sure that they get signed up to be on the working group, and then they can join the calls and they can participate in the discussions and the decisions. But you don't actually need to be a member of a W3C member company, because we also have a number of invited experts. Right now, I want to say that the number of invited experts on the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group is about 25, and that's pretty high from the perspective of other W3C groups, but we feel that it is very important because we're looking for a very broad-based representation of people who are people with disabilities, as well as people who are doing work on accessibility topics, as well as the people who are working on accessibility for the member companies. And so we have a lot of invited experts who come into the working group to bring specific expertise, whether that's about low vision concerns or cognitive accessibility concerns or digital publishing concerns. We want to make sure that we have very good representation across all the different topic areas. So if you are interested in participating in the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, it is possible for you to join even if you don't work for a member company. And so I would encourage you to look at the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group page at W3C's website. The easiest way to find it is just to Google for the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and you can find out information there about how you might be able to join. So the goals for WCAG 2.1, we have 4 primary goals that we're working toward here. Is first and foremost is we want to make sure that we're helping more people. WCAG 2.1 is designed, WCAG 2.0 is designed to help make the web more accessible, and 2.1 is designed, our goal is to design a 2.1 that does that and then some. Furthermore, a very important goal that we have, a very challenging goal that we have, is that success criteria need to be testable and implementable. And sometimes this is just an issue around specific wording, and sometimes it is a more substantial challenge. But looking at success criteria that says information presented on a web page needs to be clear would raise lots of testability questions about who that content needs to be clear to and what constitutes clarity. So when you look through WCAG 2.0 and ultimately through 2.1, thinking about it from how you test different success criteria perspective, we tried very hard to make sure that everything can be tested. Testable does not mean that it has to be machine testable in all cases. Ideally, if we could all, wave magic wands, everything would be machine testable, so it would be completely automatable. But the reality is, right now and for the foreseeable future, that there will be criteria that still require human review in order to make sure that the success criteria is met. As an example of just the testability criteria that we have, looking back at WCAG 2.0, the first success criteria is 1.1.1, which is the one that has requirements for text equivalence for non-text objects. And you can programmatically test whether an image on a web page has an alt attribute with a value or an ARIA label with a value, but you can't at this point test whether that text is appropriate or not. So you can't test programmatically. You can test it in that a human can review it and verify that it is good. So automated tests are great, beneficial. Everyone wants to do more. So automated tests are great for catching failures of 1.1.1, but human review is very often needed for confirmation that you've actually succeeded in meeting 1.1.1. So we're looking at these, the testability as a very important part of what we're doing with WCAG 2.1. The third primary goal is around technology independence. So making sure that WCAG 2.1 can be applied broadly. And we see this with WCAG 2.0 and the Access Board's work with Section 508 is a great example of that, because they are applying WCAG 2.0 to HTML web pages as well as to documents like a PDF document or a Word document, and with the advice that's being provided through another non-normative document, the WCAG 2 ICT, and that's with a number 2, so WCAG 2 ICT, that provides advice about how to interpret WCAG 2.0 for non-web documents and software. So we very much want to make sure that WCAG 2.1 continues that technology independent nature, and so we're not putting in success criteria that say you must use a specific HTML attribute to deliver additional accessibility. We are focusing on what is necessary to make sure that the appropriate types of content information are available within the content, and then we will provide techniques for different technologies. So there will be techniques for HTML, there will be techniques for PDF, there will be techniques for different technologies, EPUB, and they will all help provide a different lens into how you might meet a success criteria, a technology-independent success criteria using a specific technology. And then finally, and this is the one that I spoke to a little bit ago, which is that it has to be backward compatible with WCAG 2.0. So if you conform with WCAG 2.1, you will conform to WCAG 2.0. The opposite isn't true, in that if you conform to WCAG 2.0, you are still missing some things that are going to be required in WCAG 2.1. But the idea is that you don't have to undo any of the work that you've done to meet WCAG 2.0. You just have to meet additional success criteria. So that if you were a company making a decision about how to create products, how to deliver a website that is being judged in different areas. In some cases, it might be, in some situations, it might be judged under WCAG 2 requirements. In another situation, it might be judged under WCAG 2.1 criteria. So if you target WCAG 2.1, then you will be able to make a full conformance claim for WCAG 2.0 as well. So I want to stop there for the first set of questions. I see we have a few. And so I can go through those and just take a few minutes for that. So we have a question from Judy. Will WCAG 2.1 include the elements of tables that were part of WCAG 1.0? And I guess the short answer to that is I wouldn't expect to see WCAG 2.1 mention the elements of tables by name, but I would say that WCAG 2.0 does cover tables in that there's success criteria like 131, information and relationships, which basically say that if you have information that is presented visually as part of the page, you need to make sure that that information is semantically delivered for users, particularly users with assistive technologies, and that part of that, what is semantically delivered with that, is relationships between heading cells and data cells, and that the content is in a table is part of what's presented visually, so making sure that you're representing the data on the page as a table is covered under WCAG 2.0 already, and this is where we get a little bit into the technology independence, in that we're not saying you must use the scope attribute, you must use headers and ID in order to convey the relationship between header cells and data cells. But there are techniques within WCAG 2.0 that do say that one way to meet 131, information and relationships success criteria, is for tables to do these things. So to answer the question, we won't add anything additional. It'll just be phrased in the same way that we have it in WCAG 2.0.
Before we move on to the next question, Andrew.
Yep.
Just one quick thing. Just wanted to send a reminder to everyone who is over the phone. If you do want to ask a question, now would be a great time to unmute your line, and that is #6 to unmute your line. You can ask your question. We do have 2 more questions queued up right now, but feel free to ask as soon as we're done with those. In addition to that, you can also send your questions to webinars@accessibilityassociation.org, and I will make sure that we ask Andrew those questions. So Andrew, go ahead and answer those next questions.
Yep, sure. And then Judy has a follow-up too, since we're still on that one. What about table summaries? And right now, adding table summaries back in is not part of what we're including. I haven't been touching my mouse, so my screen went to sleep. So there, I'm back in now. The next question that we have in here is, how many rules and criteria are there in WCAG 2.1? That is a question that I'm going to answer. I'm going to evasively answer that in the slides coming up, because the short answer is we don't know yet. But we'll talk a little bit more about that one. And then Ron has a question, says, will WCAG 2.1 have any rules that counter rules from WCAG 2.0? And the short answer to that is no. So that is very much part of the backward compatibility goal that we have for WCAG 2.1. So we would not be creating a new success criteria that runs counter to any WCAG 2.0 criteria. So, for example, where there's a criteria for text resizing in WCAG 2.0, and we aren't going to do anything that will undo that text resizing criteria. We would not be changing it to say, actually, you only need to go to 150% increasing in text size for text resizing. And we could say you have to go to 400%, and this has been one of the ones that we have discussed. But we can talk a little bit more about that as I get to some of those slides where we get into the specific success criteria. So that's the questions that are in the chat. If there's anyone on the phone who has a question, now would be the time to jump in and ask. And if not, that's okay too. Okay. Well, I see one person typing. See if we we'll give it a few more seconds here. Will there be more examples in WCAG 2.1? And I guess the question there, so the examples are all going to be in the techniques and understanding documents. So really, right, and the context of this is for people who are not as technical reviewing the spec. And it really is important to use the understanding document as a tool to understand the standard. And that goes for WCAG 2.0 as well as for 2.1. So the standard will have the success criteria, but it doesn't go into great depth with specific examples because that's the role that the understanding documents will play. All right, so let's press on here. So in developing WCAG 2.1, over the past few years, we identified, and here I'm using mobile, even though earlier I said that we don't, but we do. We have a mobile accessibility task force, and one of their first recommendations was that we can't really talk about mobile. We have to talk about other things. So we had task forces for mobile accessibility, cognitive accessibility, and low vision accessibility, because there were particular concentrations of questions and concerns around these areas with regard to WCAG 2.0. So we had task forces that were doing work, and the work that they did is they identified user needs to make sure that that was clearly documented. They performed a gap analysis on WCAG 2.0 to identify where, relative to the user needs that are identified, there's problems with WCAG 2.0, and then made recommendations from that. And we received over 60 proposals for new success criteria that were submitted by the different task forces and some that came from outside the task forces. And we did, as I mentioned earlier, we published our first public working draft in February. And part of the reason that we were able to publish that working draft essentially within a month of when we were chartered is because we actually had been working on WCAG 2.1 for over a year prior to our charter. So we were working under our old charter at the W3C, but that old charter wouldn't let us publish anything that was going to be normative guidance. So we were preparing for it, and we were ready to go right out of the gate. So not all proposals that came from the task forces are going to result in new success criteria. As I said, there was 60 new success criteria proposals, and that raised some concerns in itself because right now in WCAG 2, we've got 4 principles, 12 guidelines, and 61 success criteria. So people did not all respond with joy with the idea that we might be doubling the size of WCAG with the WCAG 2.1. That was really not too much of a risk because these proposals coming from different task forces, there was some overlap, so we were combining some of them to make one success criteria proposal out of 2 or more. And some things that came from the task forces, what was determined was that the proposal was not necessarily for a new success criteria, but we needed to make sure that some of the non-normative supporting documents, our techniques documents, our failures documents, our understanding document, that these clearly conveyed all the information that was really necessary for people to understand how WCAG 2 and ultimately 2.1 can be applied to address the identified user needs. So some of the ideas that came from the task forces go to techniques and understanding. Some did wind up going into proposals for success criteria. Not all the proposals that that were targeting success criteria are going to make it into WCAG 2.1. Not all have been accepted by the working group. Sometimes that's because we haven't been able to identify testable language. Sometimes it's because there's an issue that ultimately the author doesn't have control over because it's a user agent or a browser issue that needs to be addressed. So we're not throwing away any of the good guidance and advice that is coming from the task forces. Some of that is going to wind up in success criteria from in WCAG 2.1. Some of it will wind up as supplemental guidance that we may be able to provide. We're discussing particularly for the cognitive space where there's a large number of success criteria that the working group isn't able to accept for a variety of reasons at this point in time. And so we're intending to produce a document which is supplementary guidance for addressing cognitive disabilities, and that will be useful as a guide for researchers who want to try and identify what's the most effective solution to a given problem. Also guidance for user agent developers so that if you're working on a browser or other user agent, you can look and determine what types of what problems you might be able to offer some support for. And in some cases, we're going to just be offering best practices, being able to say, this is something that is a good idea, but at this point we can't really test it well, or we can't identify implementations of this yet. So not everything can make it into a guideline today. It may be in a future version of WCAG. So with our process, and this relates to the question about how many new success criteria are there going to be. And I apologize, it feels like I'm burying the lead on that. But all the work is being done in public, and you can go and see the current editor's draft, as well as the published working drafts. These are all available and possible for people to see. And the easiest way to get to the current working draft is just to Google WCAG 2.1, and it'll come up with a URL that's in the W3C domain space, and that will be the current working draft of WCAG 2.1. So what we have right now is we have 21 new success criteria that were introduced in the latest working draft. 6 of them are at the AA level, 6 are at the single A level, 11 are at the AA level, and 4 of them are at the AAA level. In addition, we have 2 new guidelines, one that's named pointer accessible and one that's named additional sensor inputs. And we have some of the success criteria fit underneath these. And obviously these guidelines are like other guidelines. They're high-level guidance. They're more, you can just think of them as groupings of success criteria, in that you don't conform to the guidelines directly. You're conforming to the success criteria that are underneath them. So related to the question earlier about how many rules and criteria are in WCAG 2.1, today there's 21, and if you were conforming at the AA level, there'd be 17 additional success criteria. The harder question is how many are going to be there when WCAG 2.1 is published? And that is a very difficult question to answer. It has to do with how many comments we receive, the types of comments that we receive, whether there's additional information that is brought to the working group's attention that either convinces us that a success criteria is very achievable or not very achievable, so that if the 11 AA level success criteria, if there's 3 of them and we can't find any examples of anyone being able to do that effectively, correctly, in a way that benefits end users, then those success criteria won't make the cut. It's possible that something might get moved down to a AA level. It's possible that something could be removed entirely. So there's a variety of things that may happen. We very much want to not wind up with a WCAG 2.1 that has 1 new success criteria. We believe that there's additional work that we can do to help end users. But part of the iterative process that W3C has to solicit and process comments is to get broad feedback about how success criteria proposals and proposals for changes to standards in general affect tool vendors, end users, authors, and everyone throughout the, and what was the other one? Assistive technology vendors is the other particular group that that is impacted here. So that's the high-level view of what's in WCAG 2.1, and I wanted to spend some time going through a few of the new success criteria, and these are some of the ones that right now seem more likely to be moving forward. Okay, so label in name is the name of one of them. At one point this was called accessible name, and we received some comments that people were finding it confusing because we have a success criteria in 2.0, which is 412, which is name role value. And in WCAG 2.0, name refers to the programmatic name. And most accessibility APIs, or maybe even all accessibility APIs at this point, when they're referring to the name of an object on a screen or on a web page and how it's given that name to be read by assistive technologies, they refer to it as the accessibility name. If you're an HTML developer, you know that there's also a name attribute, which is used differently. And our definition in WCAG 2 explains what name means when we use it. And so we have to stick with that. So we have a new SC that we're looking at, which is called label in name. And what this one is to make sure that there is an alignment between the visible name, the visible label for a control, and the accessible name that assistive technology users hear, or that particularly for people who are using speech tools that they are expressing. So that if you have a button like the one that's shown here, which is a simple blue button with some white text that says buy now, and there's a line of HTML code, so indicating that's an input of type submit, and it's got alternative text on it, and you know the source indicates that it's the buy now PNG file, but the alt says submit your order, which one might look at and say, okay, that's kind of what you're doing there. You're looking to buy it now, and it says submit your order. Does that meet WCAG 2.0? Sure. It's not ideal, and one could reasonably question, why don't you just use the text, the short text? You actually wrote a longer name for this button than the text that's on the screen. Sometimes we have to add additional text onto a button, like if you have a series of products that are listed on a page and there's a series of buttons that say download. It can be helpful to add download Adobe Acrobat, download Adobe Photoshop, so that there's additional information beyond what's on the button. But sometimes what happens is that there's a separation between these, and particularly for a speech user who wants to be able to say, click the Buy Now button, the assistive technology doesn't know that that button says Buy Now. Buy Now is not part of the text for that. So a simple change here, so making it say Alt Buy Now, this would conform to the new success criteria that we're considering for WCAG 2.1. You wouldn't have to have it be exactly that. You could still add additional text as a best practice for encouraging that Buy Now, or whatever the visible label is the first part of the label. But it's not, this success criteria is not designed to forbid adding additional text in there, just to make sure that there is alignment between the two. So that's one of the new success criteria that we're looking at. And I guess in going through these, there's a number that I was going to review and go through. If people have questions, I will look at the chat as we go along, and I can answer questions as they come in as well. So for another one, is around graphics contrast. Yeah, someone's pointing out that I made a mistake on the last one in my code, and I did. Type equals, I should say type equals image. And image is a submit button. So yes, you're right. That example is got an error there. So I will fix that. Thank you. So type equals image, and then alt, and then the source. So everything else about it is correct, but you're right. Next one that I wanted to talk about is graphics contrast. So in WCAG 2.0, we have contrast requirements for text. So if you are presenting text on a screen, it's got to meet either a 4.5 to 1. Well, at the double-A level, it would meet 4.5 to 1 unless it's large text, in which case it would need to meet 3 to 1. At the AAA level, it goes up to a 7 to 1 ratio. But what was missing out of all this is, and I should also say that for 2.0, it was text and images of text. But what was missing is that frequently in web pages, web applications, there's graphics, there's images that are used either as controls or they're used as content-bearing, information-bearing content, and that there's no contrast requirement on those. So this was one of the areas that the task forces and the working group really felt like we needed to do more on. Similarly, for controls, there's a requirement that there has to be a focus indicator, but there's no specific contrast requirement or threshold for focus indication in WCAG 2.0. So we really wanted to make sure that we're figuring out a way to make this situation better and to be able to address the contrast requirements for non-text information. So I've got a couple of images that are part of this slide here, and one is a graphic. This came from an Adobe web page where there's what looks like a phone or a small tablet with a pen pointing at it, and it's light gray. I think I measured the contrast on this one as about 2.85 to 1, so it's certainly below the 4.5 to 1 text contrast. But directly underneath it, and it is not a linked image, by the way, also. Directly underneath it, it says, "Keep business moving on any device. Our powerful mobile apps make it easy for customers and employees alike to take next steps anytime, anywhere." And this is an image that doesn't have sufficient contrast, and based on the ratio that we have right now, it wouldn't have sufficient contrast, but this also would be part of an exception because this graphic is not required to understand and use the content. This graphic would likely be one that would be added using CSS, or it would have alt equals quote quote on an HTML page, in that it's not really necessary for the understanding of the page. So this one, even with low contrast, would pass. Next to it, this is, and if on the off chance that anybody uses Facebook, you might recognize this piece of the UI. There's a news feed, and then there's these 3 dots. We found from talking to people that some people don't even know that those dots do anything, but they do. It brings up a little menu if you click on it, and these dots are represented not as text but as 3 images, and the contrast is a little bit low. It's not too low, but it's a little bit low, and so this is something that the only way that you know that there's something there, that there's a control there, or that there's something that you might be able to do, is by being able to perceive that content that's part of the image. So this would be an image that really would need to have a higher contrast ratio in order to meet WCAG 2.1's proposed success criteria around graphics contrast. Similarly, if you're a keyboard user and you're tabbing and your focus lands on the control with those 3 dots, that focus ring that appears would need to meet the contrast ratio as well. And there's some different exceptions that are part of this success criteria as well, so that if you're using a standard control that the author doesn't have control over, then the author doesn't need to make the browser do something different. But many people are creating custom controls, and this is going to be an important new success criteria for them to pay attention to. Looks like we do have a question, and thankfully this is not one telling me that I made a mistake. So this one is from Judy, who says that for the graphic contrast, will the logo still be exempt? The short answer is yes. At present, that's part of the draft. If so, can there be something that indicates that they are creating a new logo? That if they're creating a new logo, that accessibility guidelines need to be applied. So you're suggesting that the existing logo would be exempt, but if a new logo was made, that the ratio would need to be met. And that is not currently what we don't have anything that addresses that. We have received a lot of comments that, particularly from corporate design departments, that they're very concerned about making sure that their existing branding is not impacted and that they retain that freedom in their branding. So my guess is that we won't see that in, I mean, I think that would be an additional add-on to WCAG 2.1. So I don't think that we will have that in a 2.1. It's an interesting idea that we would have to consider for a future version. Right, and Ron's saying a brand exception. And all right. Any other questions? And if anyone has any corrections for me, also, I'm perfectly happy to take them. I'm just embarrassed that that it showed up at all. All right. So let's go on to another one. So this one here, character key shortcuts is the name of it. And this one, what this one is all about is making sure that users can interact with content, that they can consume content without disruptions from accidental activation of single key shortcuts. This one is important for voice and keyboard users. Probably the most impactful example is for speech users. If you're someone who uses speech technology to interact with your computer, as well as many people use speech to assist them when they're writing, whether it's a text or a long-form document, but many people also are using tools like Dragon Naturally Speaking to interact with their content and their applications as well, whether that's because of repetitive stress injuries or because they can't use their hands or aren't able to interact using the mouse in some other way. So using voice can be very powerful, but there are and there's examples where application developers are trying to make things easy for their users, and they're putting in place keyboard shortcuts. And these keyboard shortcuts, in some cases, assume that the default interaction model for the user is the mouse. And so if you have someone who is a keyboard user and there's a key, and I think Gmail is an example of this, where there's a key that I don't remember if it's E or D, but it will archive a message that you have selected. So if you're using a keyboard and you select a message and then you inadvertently hit the, let's say it's the E key, it moves it into the archive folder, and then you'd have to navigate to go get it and bring it back if you really wanted it. It's actually even worse for someone who is a voice user, in that if you're working in an office where there's other people around and those people speak occasionally, their voices are often picked up by the microphone for a speech user, and their words can actually be entered in, and they'll have the sequence of letters that's sent through to the computer, and that letter might include the letter E. There's a lot of words that include the letter E. And so you can wind up that just because you're a speech user, you have email that is being possibly deleted, or things are added to your cart, or whatever shortcuts are used. So this success criteria is to not eliminate the use of character key shortcuts, but to make sure that the users either have a way to turn it off, which actually, if you look at the settings in Gmail, that is implemented in Gmail, or that the users are able to customize those shortcuts. And that's pretty common in a lot of, maybe more so common in desktop applications, where the user can modify the shortcut keys either entirely or add a modifier key. But any of these things will give the end user greater flexibility and avoid those types of disruptions. I see one question coming in, so we can pause for that. So this does not apply to something like Control-C. No, it does not. So if you have a modifier key that is not a printable key, the language that you'll see if you look at this success criteria is about whether a keystroke is represented as a printable character or a non-printable character. So things like escape, things like the tab key, those are non-printing and would not be considered to be character key shortcuts. There's also, we've been, one of the other exemptions in here is that if you have a specific control that, a shortcut only is only used when that specific control is focused. And we see this with things like a drop-down list, where it's got a list of all the countries in the world, and you have to select Zaire. So your focus is on that control, and you hit Z, and it jumps you down to the Z countries. And that's beneficial, and that would be perfectly fine in this situation as well. Ron is asking a question about how about languages, for example, English or Spanish. I'm not sure I'm following the question, Ron. Looks like you're giving a follow-up. Does the WCAG 2.1 rules apply to other countries as well? They are intended to, absolutely. And we do have, part of what we do is that the W3C has an internationalization group that has submitted comments, and that we work with to help make sure that we're creating a specification that is applicable to the World Wide Web, not just the North America Wide Web. And in fact, on the working group, we have many active participants. I haven't done a review to see whether every time zone is covered, but we have participants from every continent except Australia, and we have participants from time zones around the world. People in Australia, in China, Japan, India, across Europe, North and South America. So we really have very broad participation, and that really helps us make sure that we are not forgetting something or creating rules that are going to cause problems in other areas of the world. That said, WCAG 2.1, while being able to be used in other areas of the world, it still is going to also similarly depend on the adoption. But a website owner in India could decide to use WCAG 2.1 as their standard anytime, hopefully after it reaches a recommendation. Okay. So here's another one. This one goes back to the text resizing one, and I think it highlights some of the challenges that we have in defining new sufficient success criteria for WCAG 2.1. So this one is around reflowing text. In 2.0, you just need to be able to zoom text 200%. So if you have a web page and you're able to zoom the text in 200%, you pass. But often what would happen in that situation is that the text would run off the page, and it would result in a page that you needed to scroll vertically to see all of the content, and you needed to scroll horizontally to see all of the content because the information was not wrapping and reflowing. And this was and remains a substantial problem for users who are low vision, because these are the users who are much more likely to need to view their content at a higher magnification. And this is also an issue that impacts view of content on mobile devices, where there's a narrower window width that is available for that content. And we've all seen web pages where you kind of have to do this. You have to scroll horizontally as well as vertically. And I think that if anyone's had to do it for any amount of time, you can appreciate what a colossal challenge it presents for reading and comprehending content. So we tried, I think the initial proposal was that text needed to be increased over 1,000%. And we scaled that back because of implementation challenges. But what we ultimately found out is that if you're requiring reflow and you're requiring a massive level of zooming as well, that the current development techniques that are used to achieve this actually create some interesting problems for the testing of a success criteria like this. One thing you may notice if you view web pages that use responsive design is that, and it's an interesting thing to do, at least some people find it an interesting thing to do, where you have a window width and you're viewing a page, and if you look, for example, Microsoft's got a very good example of this. If you're viewing at a standard width of 1,200 or 1,600, you see one type of, one view of the content. But if you start making the window width narrower, there's different checkpoints that exist within that content where the page will be changed around. At some point, what was originally presented as a menu or a menu bar with 5 items in it gets compressed down to 2 items, or if you compress it down enough, maybe it gets turned into one of those little hamburger icons that brings up the menu separately. But there's changes to that content that can occur, and in some cases you wind up with, you make your window width narrower and the text gets smaller for a bit at least, and then it will, you can zoom up from there, but the authors will implement views that are different. So it forced us to really focus in on what we were wanting to achieve with this one, which was really to set up the conditions for success by focusing on reflow, so that if you are viewing content at a higher magnification or in a narrower window, that the content needs the reflow so that users are able to read the content with only needing to scroll in one direction. So that if you make your window narrower or you view the content on a mobile device, you're going to scroll vertically on a Western web page where it's using left to right text in order to read the content. You don't need to go back and forth horizontally as well. So that right now is the main focus of this, and the working group is thinking that in combination with the existing 200% zooming and the reflow text, is that the common practices that are used to achieve this are going to result in users actually being able to get a far greater level of magnification, maybe up to 1,000%, maybe more, so that if a site is designed in a responsive way, the text will reflow, and you'll get substantial zooming. WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 would still require just the 200, but by requiring reflow and the zooming, we expect that the end result will be far better than that. So questions that we have about this one here is, do we consider the AT when it comes to text size, knowing the user would be using a screen magnifier? We consider it insofar as the units that are used to determine this success criteria are CSS pixels, and so that the CSS pixels are going to be consistent, so that if there's magnification that's applied, then the pixel measurement would still remain the same. And issue is more prevalent in embedded maps. And one of the exceptions with this one is fairly broadly worded at this point in time, but where it's essential that content be presented in a way that requires a two-dimensional layout. So if you're showing something like a map, we can't reflow map content. We can't reflow an image or a video to show up differently on the web page, so that it does not eliminate the possibility that one might need to scroll horizontally to view content, but for textual content, we think this will bring improvements. Okay, so keeping going. This one, has anyone ever encountered a web page that looks like this? And visually what we're seeing here is a web page that is rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise. So the new SC that we're talking about here is orientation. This is particularly impactful for users who have a device that's mounted, right? Someone's in a wheelchair, maybe they're not able to use their hands, maybe they are, but their device, because they're not holding it, it's mounted, and it's mounted in a fixed position. It's either portrait or it's landscape view. And there are going to be some applications, some types of content where the portrait view is necessary. If you're, if your web content is a piano app, it may be that it is that it's necessary to have that show up in landscape view because of space constraints. But if your content is a news site, there's really no reason that would have to be restricted to be viewed in one orientation or another. And so this is one that should be easier for web content authors to conform to. And in fact, most of the time, this is entirely taken care of by the browser. It'd be an easy test to verify that their content is not doing this, but particularly if you're creating a mobile app or you're using some of the APIs that allow you to restrict the rotation of your content, this is going to serve as a check on that, so that that doesn't happen. So that if someone's in a chair or they have a mounted device, that they aren't going to have to read the content or interact with the content at a 90-degree rotation from their natural viewing. It doesn't mean that if I have a device mounted that is mounted in landscape, that I won't interact with any content, because some content may, for good reasons, need to be presented that way. So it's just something that authors are going to need to think about. Okay, and last one here is device sensors. So with a lot of mobile devices, we have additional sensors that are available. Many of you may have used the shake to undo feature with a phone, so that if you make a mistake, you can just shake the phone and get rid of it. And the concern here is that with more and more sensors available, that we need to make sure that authors are thinking about not relying entirely on that, so that if you were creating content, you're creating an application, and your only way for the user to make progress is using specific sensor data, then that would be a problem. There's users, for example, the users who have a device mounted because they're in a chair, they're not going to shake to undo. So there needs to be another way to achieve that task. And I think this is something that is, should be very easy for application developers to pay attention to and to achieve, just as long as they're thinking about it at the outset. And as we know, a lot of times in accessibility, we have problems because people, aren't aware or aren't thinking about specific issues. So this is one that should help address that. Okay, so at this point, you all seem to still be on the phone. I'm going to go out on a limb, and you're wondering how you can help. And I know that's not true for everybody, because some people are just worrying about when this is coming or want to know what's going on, want to make sure they're able to advise their organizations. But there are monthly working drafts. The next one should come out in the next couple weeks with a lot of recent updates. Last week was our big conference where the working group met for multiple days. So there's lots of changes that are coming in the next working draft. You can submit comments via GitHub or email. If you're interested in joining the working group, you certainly can. I was intending to share my screen, and I think I will very quickly because we have a few minutes left. Got the right one. There we go. So this is the WCAG 2.1 spec right here, but I want to show you. So in GitHub, if you're someone who's familiar with using GitHub, it's where we have all of it's our code repository. And you can go in and dig around here and see what we're up to. You can make comments. There's issues right here. So a variety of issues that people have raised. And when we get them, we mark them by which success criteria they apply to and who they came from. And ultimately, we use that information to improve the standards. The guidelines directory is where you can go in and you can see what are the new success criteria. And so if you want to go in and see, well, let's look at character key shortcuts. This is the entire text that gets pulled into the spec. It's just straightforward HTML, so it's mostly readable as HTML goes. And if you felt like you had a suggestion, you could either file an issue, or you could even fork the repository, make some changes, and submit it as a pull request. And the working group will receive that, evaluate it, say yes or no, or somewhere in between, and use that information accordingly. So you can see the working drafts at this raw Git address, and we can provide a link to that so that you can go and review where it's at now. Or similarly, like I was saying, if you go to WCAG 2.1, which is this one, looks very similar, and that's the latest working draft from September. So that's the very fast tour of some of our resources that we have there. But and that covers all of my content. So Any questions? Yes. So I mentioned WCAG 3.0. What can you tell us about that? I also mentioned WCAG 5.0. Neither of those is real at this point in time. There is a group, there is a task force within our working group which is working under the name Silver. And Silver is because we needed something for the next generation of accessibility guidelines, and that's AG. And because I used to study chemistry, I automatically associate that with the periodic table and the element silver. So the Silver Task Force is currently going through a process to think about what a major revision of WCAG could look like, and that would still be a couple of years down the road at a minimum. But WCAG 2.1 is backwards compatible with 2.0, and we don't want to change the existing success criteria. But at some point, we think there's going to be some benefit in doing so, and that's what this group is thinking about. So I don't know whether whether it would be called WCAG 3.0 or whether it would be called Accessibility Guidelines 1.0 or what. But I know it's at least a couple of years down the road before it's at the point where we'd be even having a webinar of this sort to talk about it. Okay, so I think that is it for this. We've only got seconds left in the time slot, and if people have any additional questions, I'm happy to hang out a little bit, but that's pretty much it. And I believe that there's a feedback form at the end that Kevin was going to bring up. But thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Andrew. So we did have one last comment from Sharisha, who would like the link that you just screen shared. So if you want to send that to me, I will make sure that gets distributed in our follow-up email. Other than that, thank you everyone for attending, and a huge thank you to Andrew. I think this was a really informative presentation, especially right on the heels of the working group meeting. And a special thanks to our captionist as well for providing such a great service. We do have a feedback survey, and it is shown on this slide here. We'll also include a link to that in our follow-up email, as well as a link to the recording. We'd love to hear from you, hear what you think. We're working on putting together the 2018 webinar series right now, so your comments about topic and content would be greatly appreciated. And I know our speakers like to hear what you think as well. So please fill that out for us. You can also select the link right here from the slide being shown. As I mentioned at the beginning, we did record this webinar, so it will be available for an archive later. And any of our other webinars that you may have missed, you can go ahead and get those from our website in the webinar archive. We do have one webinar in our 2018 series selected, and that will be Beyond the Basics of PDF Accessibility, the 2018 update. That will be on Thursday, January 18th. And the rest of the 2018 webinar series will be coming soon, so we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.